Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this panel session on renewables investment, where we're going to talk about how wind, solar, and heat networks are shaping the future of sustainable energy. My name is Anna Musat. I'm the Executive Director for Policy and Engagement at Renewable UK. I'm delighted to chair this panel today, which will give us an insight into how some of the investment trends in relation to the energy transition are shaping up. We'll hear from a range of organizations, public and private, about how they've seen the investment environment evolving over the last few years, and in the UK, particularly since the election. If we're looking at the UK, we know that the new government has come in with a mission to achieve clean power by 2030 and drive economic growth at the same time. So those are really key planks to achieving the energy transition. But we know that at the same time, we're facing pretty serious global headwinds in the form of trade wars, lower economic growth in all parts of the globe than we would have expected, and an increasingly volatile situation across the Middle East, which will obviously have repercussions for energy prices and trade flows as well. The good news is that across the world, we're investing twice as much in renewables compared to fossil fuels. So that's really good news. But we know that this isn't balanced across geographies and across all the different sectors that we need to decarbonize. So we're doing fairly well when it comes to investment in key renewable technologies like wind and solar, but we know that we need to do more across hydrogen, CCUS, and all the key technologies that we need to decarbonize key sectors such as heating and the built environment, heavy industry, and others. So today I'm really delighted to be joined by a panel that will help us unpick all of these challenges and talk us through how do we navigate this investment landscape in a fairly challenging global situation and what the opportunities are that you're seeing from the perspective of your organizations. So let me just briefly introduce the panelists. So welcome to Sarah Boyack, Shadow Cabinet Secretary for Net Zero Energy and Just Transition at the Scottish Labour Party. Pietro Rocco, Head of Sustainable Finance at the Carbon Trust. Neil McDermott, the CEO of the Low Carbon Contracts Company. Hakan Ilmaz, Senior Vice President and Chief Technology and Sustainability Officer at Carrier. And Andy Sykes, Plant Director at Siemens Gamesa. Welcome, everyone. So I'm going to start with a few questions from my side, and then towards the end of the session, we'll have time for audience Q&A. I believe there's someone here with a roving mic, so when we get to that section, please put your hand up and someone will come to you to take your question. But just to begin with, I'd like to go to everyone and just get a sense of how you've seen investment trends in the energy transition evolving. And I think particularly in the last year and a half, because we've had the election in the UK, but also globally, we've had quite a lot of elections. So how have you seen all these changes in all these political changes translating into investments in clean energy? Sarah, if I could start with you, please.
Thanks. Well, I'm going to give a slightly different perspective because we've actually been doing renewables at scale in Scotland for over 2 decades. And when I set the first target of 20% of electricity from renewables, it was seen as a bit bold and radical. And now on a good day, over 100% of our electricity comes from renewables. And that comes from solar, on and offshore wind, it comes from sea-based turbines, it's now going to have floating offshore wind and solar, massive opportunities, and we're seeing it right across the country. Our renewables industry generated over £15 billion in output in 2022, and last year we had 900 renewables projects in the planning pipeline. So there's massive industry interest, and I think our challenge is how we make the connections, whether it's with the communities in terms of community ownership or benefits, where the councils get involved. I think maybe more how we use our electricity, where we use it. So if you think about bringing down our carbon emissions, EVs is obvious, buses, railways, heat in our buildings. You know, when we negotiated on our first renewables targets, I managed to get all new homes had to have some form of renewables. The easiest one to do was solar. So all of our new buildings pretty much are having solar. But I'd like to see us using the electricity we're producing closer to home. So I'd like us to see us doing things like heat networks like they do in Europe. That's more complicated, but massive investment opportunities. And I think it's that thing about being positive and showing communities benefits. So I think the establishment of GB Energy, the National Wealth Fund, the industrial strategy that was launched yesterday, there are so many opportunities. The one thing I would also want to do is to build the kit in Britain. So that's why I loved yesterday's announcement, because we've been doing renewables for 20 years in Scotland, but we don't build stuff in Scotland, we import it all. And if you want to make renewables more popular, good jobs, people can see in their communities, that will lift it up the agenda and make planning a bit faster. You shouldn't have to wait over 2 years to get a planning application through, but that needs resource and planning. So lots of things we need to fix. But what I want to say is I am really positive, because if you get confidence, certainty, the supply chains will bloom, you'll get investment, and local communities will see that benefit and they feel a lot more supportive. If you don't get it right, it's more challenging. So let's get on with the positive upsides and learn from our experience. Thanks.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you for highlighting all those other sectors that where we need to move in tandem to really ensure that we're using all of that excess power to decarbonize right across the economy. And we'll come back to some of those points around community acceptance and how we ensure that the kit is made in the UK, because that's very topical with the industrial strategy yesterday. Pietro, could I come to you for an overview of investment trends?
Yeah, absolutely. So where I sit, just for context, is kind of dealing directly with the financial sector. So the Carbon Trust has been around for 25 years. We've worked on offshore wind acceleration, policy engagement, energy systems, heating. Where my team comes into the equation is dealing directly with the investors. So understanding kind of what their exposures are, what their appetites are. And I think with, it's going across the pond for a second, with the recent kind of developments in the US, there's been a lot of talk about there isn't enough investment. There's a rowback in investment trends, and we're not seeing that. We're seeing them get quieter, certainly. Less appetite to stick your head over the parapet. Of course, they're maybe not moving quick enough on oil and gas exposures and other hard-to-abate sectors, but the capital is there. The issue, though, is deployment. And how do you deploy it where it needs to go quickly? Ravi Menon yesterday, who's effectively the Singaporean minister, said that if you look at emerging markets, development banks are actually crowding out private sector investment. There just isn't enough pipeline to kind of go around. So I think to Sarah's point, when you start looking at it from a local lens, when you start looking at things in partnership, in dialogue, that's when you open up a lot more opportunity. The other thing I think it's important to note, and I'm sure my fellow panelists more on the actual technology side will mention, is that not all these technologies are at the same level of not only maturity but also market familiarity. So when we think about offshore wind or we think about solar, these are things that have been part and parcel of green bond issuances for 10, 15, maybe 20 years in some cases. Once you start getting into CCUS, you start getting into hydrogen, these are new innovations. They take time to build up to institutional capital. So finance isn't homogenous, and it needs to be viewed through the lens of what fits where and what do innovators and managers and company owners need to do to access those sources of finance. If you're a Siemens Gamesa, I mean, you can pull out a green bond, and they have. But if you're a sort of CCUS innovator, is your business case actually set up to go to a bank and get a loan? Should you be looking more at the sort of venture capital? We run accelerators now that don't look so much at offshore wind as a technology. It looks at how do we work with innovators to cover both the technological side and the advancement, but also the venture itself.
Thank you, Pietro. And I think we'll come back to some of those points, because it's really interesting what you said about the different financial instruments that we need to bring in the capital to different technologies. And as I mentioned, I think with offshore wind we've done pretty well, but we definitely need to move much quicker on some of the other technologies. So thank you for that. Neil, could I come to you next, please?
Yes, thank you, Anna. I'm Neil McDermott. I am CEO of the Low Carbon Contracts Company. So LCCC is a not-for-profit company that's owned by DESNZ, the Department of Energy Security and Net Zero. We've been going for around 10 years and we're the counterparty and settlement body for the Contracts for Difference. So Contracts for Difference, it's a 15-year contract with a fixed price for renewable generators and also now more recently for CCUS and hydrogen and other areas of the economy, which is a tool for attracting investors into emerging technologies. And what we've seen over the last 10 years, in particular in areas like offshore wind, is that the CFD and those early projects have enabled the supply chain to innovate, increase the size of turbines, bring down the cost, learn how to build these projects. And so that story has been one of really scaling up and bringing down the cost of these technologies as they move from being emerging into more accepted and stable technology types. That has, behind that has been a huge amount of interest in investing in these projects. And the CFD really has given the confidence to investors to come into that sector. I think over the period, more than 60 billion has been invested. And we now see that renewables is generating, I think in 2024, renewables generated more than 50% of electricity demand in the UK. And of course, we've been working in that renewable sector as we've seen solar take a greater and greater part. In fact, in the auctions, solar contracts make up the majority in terms of numbers of contracts, where offshore wind often dominates in terms of capacity. But we're seeing ever more technologies come in, so tidal, geothermal, etc. So, we're seeing more and more technologies come in, and we've worked with government over the last few years to develop this concept of the CFD to be able to be applied to areas like CCUS, hydrogen. We've now signed our first green hydrogen CFDs. There's the first CCUS, what we call a dispatchable power agreement up at Net Zero Teesside. We're expecting more projects in these technologies and areas to come through this year. And indeed, the spending review in the last week has been, I hope, a bit of a game changer, giving that real clarity to the sector around, the investment in the clusters of Teesside and HyNet, but also Acorn and Viking, and really helping give that clarity to investors going forward in those new emerging areas. So, and of course, then we have allocation round 7 this year, expected to be the biggest allocation round for renewable electricity generation. And behind that is CP 2030, so Clean Power 2030. And the Labour government and the Secretary of State really have, in my view, turbocharged the ambition in this area around CP 2030. There are some policy choices to be made, and investors are waiting for some decisions on those. But at LCCC, we're doing everything we can to try and make sure that auction and the contracts that we sign as a result of that, which could be more than 200 CFDs and potentially a 50% increase in the size of the portfolio, then we're really hoping that will be a success. Thank you.
Thank you, Neil. And I'm sure we'll come back to allocation round 7. I think everyone's really anticipating to see what comes out of that. There's, as you said, a lot of ambition behind it, but at the same time, quite a few changes happening. And yeah, really good to hear mention of some of those other technologies where you've signed the contract. So we'll come back to that as well. But Hakan, I'm going to come to you next because you've got more of a global perspective. So could you give us a sense of how you're seeing these investment trends in the energy transition at the global level?
Absolutely. First of all, I have to say this is one of the coolest setups I've ever seen with all the glooming headsets. It feels like a Coldplay concert than a panel, but I'll try to focus. Now, what we're seeing is, first of all, I'm with Carrier Global. For the ones who don't know the company, we're one of the world's largest air conditioning company. And Carrier is the inventor of the modern HVAC. So anytime you have a hot weather outside, you turn on your HVAC, you can thank to Willis Carrier, who is the founder of the company. We also operate with different brands like Viessmann Climate Solutions in Europe, Toshiba in Asia. We are in about 160 countries, providing heating, cooling to over 70 million homes around the world. About 500 million people are using our equipment today. So the relevance to the energy side, we see a lot of investments, of course, in AI data centers, microchip factories, electric cars, hydrogen electrolyzers, heat pumps. We're looking at economical growth through more industrialization, more intelligent solutions, more electrification, and all of these require energy, electricity. It's the foundation. Any type of economical growth, any type of industrial growth, any type of electrification, the foundation is the energy infrastructure. And where does energy come from? You can transform from furnaces to heat pumps, assuming that it's clear, clean and green, but it's clean as much as your grid. If your grid depends on fossil fuels, heat pumps will not help you too much. So our vision as Carrier is to be a global leader in intelligent climate and energy solutions. Because if you look at the overall global CO2 footprint, about 40% of global CO2 footprint is the built environment. And about 40% of that is us, HVAC industry. So 15 to 20% of the entire global CO2 comes from HVAC. And if you look at it from the industry perspective, over 99% of our CO2 footprint is our products and their life cycle and what kind of energy they use for 10 to 15 years in someone's backyard, providing heat and cooling to that house or the building or the data center. And if you look at how the grids are operating today, the grids are very inflexible. They are providing electricity to the built environment and other infrastructure in a very inflexible way. If you need more energy, what do? You have two options. Option one, build more capacity. If you have a new data center, build more capacity or build flexibility on the demand side to push your electrons to the data center, utilizing the flexibility you built into the system. So we see both, right? Massive investment in all of these trends and massive investments in energy infrastructure as well as the demand side controls, and this is what we're working on. My background is in automotive and aerospace. In those industries, any type of moving vehicle, everything is energy defined. You have a vehicle that has limited energy resource on board, and everything in that car or airplane is designed around that limited energy resource. And they're all synchronized in operation. They're all intelligent thinking about the limited energy you have that defines your range. In the built environment, we take energy for granted for decades. We plug in our electric car, heat pump, refrigerator, everything. We expect the electricity will be there and it's going to be affordable and reliable. But it's changing. A lot of competition is coming to the grid with all these industrial investments, especially the data centers and other investment we are seeing. There's a lot of competition. So we need to think about how we change, how we build those grids, how we operate them, especially with renewables, because renewables are great as long as they're complemented with energy storage. Because electrons are like ice cream, they're perishable. If you don't store what you harvested, they're gone. And electricity needs to be generated and consumed at the right place at the right time. And renewables, again, they're great, but they need energy storage, either on the demand side or at the grid side to complete the full picture. And as Carrier, our focus is how do we build our HVAC systems and built environment solutions in a more grid-friendly way.
Thank you, Hakan. I think it's really interesting that you've brought that dimension around how we look at the generation and demand side together. And I think critically that point around grid flexibility is really important. We're seeing the UK government pay more attention to it now with Clean Power 2030. But I'll come back to you because I'd be really interested to see how that compares across other geographies. Andy, could I come to you, please, with an overview of how you're seeing the investment trends?
Yeah, thanks, Anna. For those who have not met, my name's Andy Sykes. I'm plant director at Siemens Gamesa. I manage the largest manufacturer of offshore wind turbine blades in the country. We have a factory which is 9 years young and has expanded 4 times in that period. It's been enormous in terms of the change the investment in the renewable sector in particular has brought around. We now employ 1,300 people, another 200 people on the site to support the physical infrastructure. We operate 24/7, around 50 weeks of the year as well. But of course that investment has come at a price. Around £500 million has been invested in the factory and the surrounding port infrastructure. We're part of the Siemens Energy Group overall and very passionate, like this group is, around the energy transition. And of course Siemens Energy plays a huge role in that, because the grid, which has been mentioned to my right here, is also one of the investment pieces. I think for us in terms of investment, we see opportunities all around us. We're proof of what can happen when investment is made around sustainable work, sustainable employment in those areas. And it's about that creative thinking, that vision, and being bold, having the support. I'm pleased that Sarah mentioned some of the investment in Scotland. Moray West is a project that we delivered off the east coast of Scotland. The blades coming from, not Scotland I'm afraid, Sarah, but from Hull, certainly on the east coast. And I'd point you in the direction of other opportunities in the region as well, as part of the Future Humber group, represented here in one of the stands. Please take time to go and see where you could invest. The opportunities that lie in that region, not just in the renewable sector, but the industries associated with that. The vision is shared in that region to drive net zero and to decarbonise. And with that, it presents lots and lots of opportunities. And I'm pleased to say we're just one of those.
Thank you, Andy. And I've been to your factory. It's really cool. If you haven't been, I'd encourage all of you to go. And I actually saw one of the Moray West blades being prepared. The size is just incredible. I think you kind of know in your head, but it's a different thing when you see it.
Yeah, there are the Moray West blades. They're 108 metres in length, just to give you a sense. So not like the ones that you might pass on the motorway. Around 50 tonnes. We've now transitioned, Anna, actually, so you'll need to come back. But we're making 115 metre blades now, so that will be our 4th transition in 9 years. So yeah, quite incredible.
Yeah, that's amazing. And we'll come back to that point around how we get that continued investment in the supply chain and the manufacturing capabilities. But actually that brings us nicely on to the question I wanted to ask you, Sarah, around some of the investment that we're seeing in Scotland. Because you've mentioned there's a lot of generation in Scotland, a lot of the renewable energy projects are being built there, which is great. The Scottish Government has also made £500 million available for supply chain investment. But I wanted to just get a sense from you of how does that feel on the ground? And crucially, I know a key priority for Scotland is delivering a just transition for oil and gas communities. So could you tell us how you're seeing that investment making an impact for local communities?
Yeah, well, I would say there's so much more to do to make those connections. Because up the northeast of Scotland, we've had oil and gas for decades, and we will have for years to come. But to attract people into the renewable sector, people with oil and gas experience, knowledge of working out in a really rough environment in the North Sea, we need to make sure you've got contracts, supply chains, decent jobs. The trade unions were here, they would say terms and conditions. And that issue about building the kit. So in my patch in Edinburgh, Vestas have a project, they've applied for planning permission to build really big renewables kit in Edinburgh, but they need the market. And one of the big projects, Berwick Bank's been sitting on a minister's desk for a couple of years. So there's something about joining up the dots to make things work more effectively and more coordinated, and I think that's our big lesson. And also about the opportunities that come. There's not just battery storage, pumped hydro. 1945 we saw the first hydro stations in Scotland. We can now do pumped hydro storage, so you use the electricity when you've got far too much of it. And I think it's that joined up thinking that we know we need to do it, but actually doing it to create those jobs, I think that is the big opportunity. And that would then let local people see the benefits that are going to come, not just in 1 or 2 places, but right across the whole country.
Thank you, Sarah. And just to quickly follow up on that, we've had the industrial strategy published yesterday. Do you get a sense that that's a stepping stone towards that more joined up thinking, or do you think there's more to do?
Oh, I think at the UK level, definitely. And we're also getting governments working together. I'm in opposition in Scotland, but I'm very strong to support our government to do more in Scotland. It's SNP on renewables. And having discussions with Michael Shanks, Energy Minister, Ed Miliband, that is like seen as revolutionary because that didn't happen for the last couple of decades. So there's something about getting people to work together and also not to forget our local authorities. That's where people's voices are heard locally, and that's where you can do some of the transformational stuff. So like we've got a solar community co-op in Edinburgh. I think every city should have them. It works, it invests, and our schools now get extra money from the solar co-op. And it wasn't difficult to establish, just took them a decade. So I think learning lessons, we are not good at sharing best practice, and I think at the local level, if we did more of that, you would see a lot more of the transformation, and people would see the benefits directly.
Thank you, Sarah. And arguably, Scotland is a really good test case for that because you've moved much faster in terms of that decarbonisation, installed capacity of renewables.
The bit we haven't really done is things like heat networks. So the government's giving $2.5 million to the entirety of our local authorities. I would do more heat networks like they've done in Denmark, low carbon, use our spare capacity in electricity, and then people would see the benefits on the ground, but it needs a bit of work, both in urban and rural areas. And again, would be infrastructure, would be jobs. So it's having that vision and doing all that joined up thinking. If we did that, it's already good, it'd be even better.
Thank you, Sarah. And I think this point around public acceptance will also come up in some of the questions, so we can come back to it. Pietro, I wanted to come to you next. You've mentioned that you work with a lot of investors across the globe, and I'm just curious to see what you're hearing from those who are choosing to invest. What's the sort of make or break for them? And I wanted to follow up on some of the remarks that you made around different financial instruments that we need for different technologies. Particularly if we're looking at early stage innovation, what kind of financial instruments do you think we need there? And how do we build on what we've already seen in the market?
Yeah, thanks, Anna. I mean, taking the first bit around, taking the second bit first on kind of more the innovation. I think a lot of debate happens around what are the good financial instruments, what aren't the good financial instruments. I mean, the reality is, especially in the UK, where we've got the City of London, we have a pretty sophisticated financial services sector. I don't think we need to be reinventing the wheel. There's a lot out there that can be used. So if you're not restructuring finance, then why isn't enough necessarily going in? I think firstly, there needs to be a recognition that an investment is an investment, right? There are returns expectations. It's unfortunately, in many cases, not just altruistic. So the business case needs to be there. Where we've come in at the Carbon Trust, and I think we don't have shareholders, we're entirely mission driven, which helps us kind of go off on a limb sometimes on projects, isn't necessarily looking to prove or disprove the technology. It's how do we empower the founders to go out and raise the capital they need to scale up or to launch. Often, incredibly passionate, highly technical people with really, really good ideas, but they could be engineers, they could be scientists. They don't necessarily have the knowledge to go out and talk to a bank or a venture capital or a private equity or answer questions from a local authority pension fund. I could come on to they should be doing a lot more investment in the UK. I think it's one of the great sort of tragedies that Canadian pension funds own most of our water companies, for example, but sort of helping them build those business cases, gain that sophistication, be able to talk not just about their technologies, but the business model that goes around them is a great way to kind of help launch these companies. The flip side is this debate around investability and bankability, which is something we just hear about all the time, and it's got so boring. Like, innovation is inherently risky, whether you invest in climate innovation or tech innovation or food and ag innovation, it doesn't really matter. And that's what investors are partly there for as well. They're risk managers, right? And they need to understand that the risks that they're facing are only going to get worse through climate change, right? So this traditional notion of bankability probably needs to change as well. But yeah, going back to the sort of structures, I think for innovators, it's a lot more on the equity side. For more institutional capital, you've obviously got very, very well-established structures like GSS Plus bonds. So you've got green bonds, sustainability-linked loans. That's kind of where the banking sector comes in really effectively. And despite the headwinds, we haven't seen a major fall in issuance volumes. They're still too small, in my opinion, but they're there. And there are still loads and loads of good examples across a range of industries, big energy projects, data centers, green buildings, charging infrastructure, all sorts. I guess the question is, could say local authorities or devolved governments also benefit from some of those to raise institutional capital where they are? There used to be quite a well-developed green uni-bond market in the US. It'd be really interesting to see a structure like that in the UK that would then allow places like the Humber to go out and raise its own capital.
Thank you, Pietro. And I think this point around bankability, we come across that all the time as well, particularly when you're looking at technologies like green hydrogen or floating offshore wind. The investors just ask all of those questions. I always wonder if it's a...
Do they always understand the answers, though?
I don't think so.
Yeah, exactly.
But I think there's also a question of, is this dependent on the environment that we're in right now, because everything's seen as more risky, or is it technology dependent, or maybe a combination of both?
I mean, I'd say one of the things I don't hear enough is that climate risk is probably the biggest risk out there. I mean, not only is it its own risk, but it is a risk enhancer for all the other risks you could think about. And so, it's not bankable, okay, by traditional metrics, but it is addressing risks that are so much greater than any we've probably faced over the last at least 50 years. That I'd argue that's a counterpoint, but it has to be backed up with a solid business case that a financier can actually get their head around, even if they struggle with the complexities of the technology itself.
Thank you, Pietro. And actually, Neil, this brings me nicely onto the question I wanted to ask you, because in the LCCC, you've got a good overview of actually how does government policy translate into investment contracts being signed. And you've mentioned some of the other technologies where you're seeing more investment coming in, like hydrogen and CCUS. If you look at the range of technologies that we need to build in order to deliver the energy transition and have a good and stable power system, what do you think the gaps are? Where do we need to do more? And what's the role of government policy there?
Thank you, Anna. Well, the government has set out its agenda for Clean Power 2030. And NESO, the National Energy System Operator, in its report, I think probably in Q4 last year, set out the technologies and the capacities that would be required for CP 2030. So, for example, solar, up to 25 gigawatts of additional solar capacity. That's a tripling of the solar capacity on the system. Up to 20 gigawatts of additional offshore wind, up to 10 gigawatts of additional onshore wind. So, and they're big slugs of capacity that are required to try and meet CP 2030. Alongside that, we have CCUS for electricity, gas-fired electricity generation. That will be important, and also hydrogen. And so, for instance, with hydrogen, so we've got production of green hydrogen. That's hydrogen through electrolysis, that is coming from renewable electricity. But also at a larger scale, blue hydrogen. So that's using gas to generate electricity through electrolysis and turn it into hydrogen. So all of these technologies are going to have to be developed at pace, and will all contribute towards achieving CP 2030, but also beyond as we go towards net zero. A diverse energy system is undoubtedly, in my view, a good strategy. Reliance on one technology has its risks, and so if you can have a diverse energy system, then that would seem to be sensible to me. And of course, these technologies are, certainly from a renewables perspective, are strategically independent for the country as well, which has its attractions in the geopolitical environment, Anna, that you mentioned. And of course, they're attracting massive amounts of investment into the country and into regions of the country that really benefit from that investment. So yeah, we're seeing all of that appetite there. We talk about allocation round 7 for renewables, which will be incredibly important. But of course, that's just the renewable side of things. And the spending review, investment in the clusters that I mentioned earlier, but also the announcements this week around the 1 billion investment in supply chains. So absolutely critical that if we're going to build all of this at pace, that we have the supply chains that are capable of delivering all of those projects, and a grid that everyone can connect to. So it's not going to be without challenge, and we can't just think about the different types of capacity. We have to think about the value chains from the supply chains and the skills and workforces, which I know the government are focused on.
Thank you, Neil. And yeah, really good point about the value chains. At Renewable UK, we often do an exercise to look at what's the economic value to different regions from deploying all of these technologies. And I think even if you look at the supply chain map across the UK, it's quite interesting because there's much more than you'd assume there. Actually, Andy, I'm going to come to you next because the question ties in nicely with this one. Supply chains are obviously really critical to delivering the energy transition, but also to delivering that local benefit. You've mentioned about all the jobs that the factory is secures. So I'd be interested in hearing more about what do we need to do to bolster those supply chains, because we know we need more to meet those targets. And also if the industrial strategy, if you feel it helps with that.
I think a number of the topics have been covered by our peers in some respect, and the ambition of 2030 is, of course, a welcome one, certainly from my perspective, my own personal perspective as well. But the challenge to mobilise the supply chain in that period is enormous, and of course, our policy makers need to understand the reality of that target and to make sure that the policies, the red tape, the support is there in abundance in order to achieve some of those targets. If you just take the offshore wind target as an example, I was just doing some fast maths in my head. As the only offshore factory in the country, I need to go a bit faster, ultimately to meet those targets. That will be the message I take back to my team. Because, of course, an investment that comes around, our factory was 5 years in the making. We're now 5 years away from that target. In reality, investments like that require huge mobilisation, whether they're from small organisations or large organisations. They take time. They do take time. And we need to look for those opportunities to take time out of the process, not to rush things or to make mistakes along the way or to open the door to mistakes, but rather to meet some of these aspirational targets, but make those aspirational targets a reality. From a work perspective, then, I have people within the factory within 9 years who've had 3 to 4 promotions in that time. It's phenomenal. They're now working on a global stage, perhaps coming from an economic background where they've not anticipated working in that kind of environment, in a diverse environment where we're meeting lots of different people and having the opportunities to travel the world in part as well. So that helps drive aspiration. It shows that people are imaginations captured. We had more than 28,000 people apply to work at the factory alone. It shows that we're now a small catchment of around quarter of a million. 28,000 people are committed along this journey as well. So enormous statistics. But yeah, so I think there's a number of challenges that we need to overcome. We need to face into and talk about some of the realities of those challenges, because only by doing so can we start to tick off the things we need to do collectively to make those aspirations a reality.
Thank you, Andy, and really interesting to hear about the 5 years it took to get the factory up and running, and we're 5 years away from the target. we've talked a lot about Clean Power 2030, but obviously we need to look beyond that to make some of these investments happen. Hakan, I'm going to come to you because you've mentioned a lot about digital innovation, integration of renewables. So I was just wondering how you're leveraging that in Carrier to accelerate the decarbonization of the built environment. And also if you could tell us a little bit about any implications of that on grid flexibility or affordability.
So let's wrap up the discussion with the HVAC, the coolest topic, right? So what we're working on is we've done an analysis on how the HVAC deployment affects the grid and how the grid operates. And the results are fascinating. We looked at US, European countries and cities, India, Japan, China. About 3.5 billion people live in warm and hot climate zones where HVAC is needed. Slightly over 10% of these people have HVAC access today. India, hot and humid climate, only 7% of the people have access to HVAC. And as the middle class grows, HVAC market grows. So it's great for our business, but something has to change. Because if you look at Europe, it's about 20% HVAC deployment, roundabout on average. More air conditioning on the south, more heat pumps on the north. If you look at US, almost every single home, 9 out of 10 homes have air conditioning. And if you look at the differences between how the US grid operates and the rest of the world operates, it's very different. US grid was designed back in the 1950s to deliver HVAC load to big homes. And over 400 utilities, statewide controlled, and some regulated, some deregulated. HVAC load on the US grid on a normal day is about 20%. On a super hot heat wave, it exceeds 70%. So air conditioning between 6 and 10 p.m. on a super hot day and heat pumps between 5 and 6 a.m. on a super cold day defines the size of the US grid peak, no matter where you go. And if you want to add on top of that industrial growth, well, you have a problem, and that's what we're challenged with. US grid is about 750 gigawatt of peak load today. We as Carrier are in over 30 million homes. 1 out of 3 homes in the US have Carrier solution. So we're the market leader. If you combine all of our residential HVAC load on the US grid, we exceed 100 gigawatts. So we have close to 15% of the peak load as one brand in the US. And that's our mission. Our mission is to transform that uncontrollable HVAC load to a controllable grid asset in the next decade or so. That's our mission. In Europe, when you look at the demand response, right? In Europe, let's say in UK, Germany, Netherlands, northern part, heat pumps. And heat pumps are mostly air to water. That means you have hot water circulation under the floor, on the radiator, and they typically come with hot water storage tanks. So all you need to do in most cases, preheat before the peak time, turn off the thermostat, you can cruise through for a couple of hours on the peak, and you solve most of your problem on the grid with heat pumps. Air conditioning is different. Air-to-air systems are different. If you go south to Spain or go to Florida, Palm Beach, Florida, where we are located as Carrier, if you turn off someone's thermostat, in 15 minutes that person will start sweating. So demand response needs energy storage on board. And this is exactly what we're doing, right? We're launching a new program in the US and then the rest of the world to follow where it makes sense. We're embedding batteries with our HVAC units, turning them into like a plug-in hybrid systems that are connected to the grid, to the cloud, real-time, latency less than 5 seconds. We build a completely controllable, dispatchable demand response, peak shaving system with our scale. We install about 2.5 million HVAC units in the US every year. With that solution, we can build up to 10 gigawatt of flexibility into the US grid every year. It's massive. And we're super bullish on this solution, piloting with several utilities starting the next couple of months and growing after that.
Thank you, Hakan. That's really interesting and quite a big challenge, but interesting to see that you're looking at the solution and the challenge. So, yeah, definitely we'll be looking forward to learning some lessons from that on the UK side. I know that we're nearly out of time, so I might just take one question, if that's okay. I think we've got a question here at the front. I don't know if anyone's... Yeah.
Hi there. Thank you for that. That was really interesting to see. You've talked a lot about raising the capital for the different renewable projects and phasing out the fossil fuel side, but you've touched on the grid, which is obviously the elephant in the room in a lot of ways for this. As you've touched on as well, flexibility is very crucial for the future operation of said grid as well. But one thing in terms of flexibility and dispatchability, for instance, Clean Power 2030, the actual target is something along the lines of 97% clean energy and then a little bit of peaking power within that mix, isn't there? So coming on to the cost of energy for the consumer, as we know, it's very well correlated with the price of gas, and that's all to do with the final kilowatt hour that's produced and the most expensive asset. If we're not fully establishing a full renewable grid a lot of the time, are we going to see very big fluctuations in that price for the consumer? Because I'm not 100% sure how that would work. And then secondly, if that is the case, particularly with things like carbon capture, which will increase the price of this gas-based generation, this dispatchable generation, what are the solutions to that? Is zonal pricing a solution to that, or will that make it very uneven and unequal as well?
Thank you. I might take just one more question. We've got one at the back, and then...
Thank you. Gordana Kirans, MGT Open from Croatia. I have a question. I haven't heard the term the circular economy, focus of my work, in this discussion. Yes, we talked a lot about grids and grid flexibility, but how about material availability, let's put it this way, and material flows, and how much of what you do and of the materials that you use can actually come back and help us also expand that grid in terms of secondary materials and the application of the circular economy. Thank you.
Thank you. So we've got a couple of questions. One on that point around the cost of energy and that marginal technology setting the price. Neil, I don't know if you want to come in on that.
Yeah. So I guess a couple of things I'd say. One is electricity suppliers. I haven't worked for an energy company for a while, but my experience of them is that they will hedge their purchases of electricity over probably a 2 to 3 year period ahead of delivery, and that will serve to dampen down volatility. So, for electricity delivered tomorrow, some of it will have been bought 2-3 years ago on the forward market, and so what they do is they layer in additional volumes over time. Industrials do it as well, so they'll be layering in their purchase of electricity. I guess the other thing I'd say is that the CFD, as it's applied to more and more amounts of renewables, actually is a fixed price for remuneration to generators. So the way the CFD works is it's a difference payment between the wholesale market that you're talking about, for instance, for offshore wind, which is a day-ahead reference price in the contract, and the fixed price that generators receive. So in many respects, a lot of the industry receives that fixed price in the CFD. And of course, as we see, and the CFD already covers almost 40 gigawatts of contracted generation. And of course, we'll see that grow over time. And you might consider that to be a long-run marginal cost of generation. And the wholesale market, perhaps is a short-run marginal cost or a dispatch signal to the market as well. So I guess my point is that there are other things going on other than just that short-run marginal wholesale price.
Thank you, Neil. Sarah, did you want to come in on that from a Scottish perspective?
Yeah, I think there's something about how and when we use our electricity, and the company I get mine from has started talking about if you want to charge your EV, here's when you charge it and you'll get a lower price. that's going to mean a big consumer awareness upkick. We're all going to need to know an awful lot more than we do now. It's not just automatically turn it on and off, it's think about when you turn it on, how you do that. And I think that could feed through into business as well. So there's something about making the best possible use of that electricity when it's around and using storage as well. And the circular economy aspect, we're actually in that debate in Scotland at the moment, because how do you design your new turbines and can you use the old ones when they need to be replaced? And that's an active discussion, which is quite a challenge. And actually it might be a bench in a park. So there's all sorts of opportunities, but it's getting people to think about it now rather than thinking about it afterwards once they're all dumped. So not easy issues, but if you integrate the circular economy right throughout your entire economy, then you start getting both business and consumer benefits.
Thank you, Sarah. Pietro, did you want to comment?
Yeah,
as
and
well?
just on that circular economy piece, particularly when it comes to sort of big energy infra projects, ICMA, who are the International Capital Markets Association, effectively set the standards for what is a good green bond and all the alignment. There's been a big debate on that. So at the moment, all of the KPIs that you're reporting on for impact are to do with grid shifts and avoided emissions. You're not seeing KPIs as much as perhaps I think we would all like to see them. Let's say percentage of reuse as opposed to new materials going into wind turbines or going into solar panels or wherever it is possible. And I think that's where the financial sector is also on its own journey of actually understanding how to incentivize these, I'd say, what are currently secondary co-benefits, but are extremely important. And I think that we hope will eventually become kind of part and parcel of the intentionality of these financing structures.
Thank you, Pietro. Andy, did you want to come in on the circularity point?
Yeah, just in response to the question at the back there, I think there are things ongoing. I'd love to make the supply chain more sustainable, to shorten some of the routes, but of course it requires the investment that I think has been talked about here, and also the bravery and the commitment of investors to make that step. But there are things happening on the market. We are producing recyclable blades. In fact, the world's largest order of recyclable product. But it comes at a premium to the client, and perhaps that's something that needs to be thought through more carefully for the future, because of course there is only one world in this sense. So ultimately there are other innovations coming too. The production of hydrogen through wind turbines is also a possibility. I saw in the news this week solar panels being used for a similar purpose from using salt water or the oceans. So there are definite opportunities there to take advantage of more circular solutions, which are both economically sound, but also are good for the environment as well.
Thank you, Andy. Hakan, did you want to come in on any of those points around circularity or grid flexibility?
I could maybe add to the cost question on the utility, because that's an important one for us. If you have an AI data center and you need 100 megawatt new capacity energy to run those AI chips in that data center, how many options do you have? You can wait for a new nuclear power plant, takes about 10 years. You can wait for a new gas turbine, takes about 5 to 7 years. You can wait for battery and solar combo, it takes about 3 to 5 years. You need land, a lot of land. You can try to build your own energy solution and generators behind the meter yourself, also super expensive. And any of those would increase the overall cost of electricity to the consumers, homes, and everyone on that grid. If you build a solution that's scalable, like the one we're working on, one of the examples, on the demand side flexibility, peak shaving, firm peak shaving, daily peak shaving, reduces your peak load. What it does is that flexibility improves and increases your overall capital utilization of your existing capacity. Generation, transmission, distribution of your existing capital is better utilized with demand-side flexibility. So what you can do is you can absorb more industrial load by shifting the peak from built environment to data centers, have them pay into the system, your existing system, that actually reduces the cost to the homeowners. That's the solution we're coming to market with.
Thank you, Hakan. I'm afraid we're out of time, so I'm going to have to wrap up there. But thank you so much for those really interesting insights into how we build the generation, the supply chain, the local impacts, the finance perspective, as well as the demand side. And thank you to all of you for your questions.
Okay.
Please join me in thanking our panelists for their contributions today.